Psalm 68 is very unique. It's kind of difficult to classify because there's nothing quite like it elsewhere in the Psalter. It portrays a very dramatic picture of Yahweh as the rider of the clouds in the heavens, leading his people from Mount Sinai in the desert to their own home in the promised land, trouncing enemies along the way, receiving praise in the land where he has come to dwell with his people. Seems to be a triumphal procession that's taking place simultaneously in heaven and on earth, as it portrays this march from Mount Sinai and Moses to Mount Zion and David. So two mountains will figure prominently in this procession. The structure of the psalm is a series of episodes, each 3 to 5 verses in length, for a total of 9 stanzas. The occasion for the psalm is very likely a festival hymn. I think this psalm gives us an insight into what Hebrew worship would have looked like in the days of David and following. People gathered, singing, processions, parades, in a sense. So that was the occasion here as they reenacted the events throughout their redemption history, whether that's the Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, Pentecost. This was an opportunity to recount the story of the Exodus. So by genre, it is classified as a hymn of praise to Yahweh. Giving an overview here, I want to note, first of all, just the way the names of the Lord are used. We have Adonai, Lord, occurring twice here in verses 11 and 17. Almighty, that is El Shaddai, occurring in verse 14. Then a reference to the divine name, Lord, Yahweh. That's Lord, all caps. His name is the Lord. His name is Yahweh, the Lord God, verse 18. But as you can see, the name Elohim is the one that predominates. And that's fitting because book 2 of the book of Psalms is largely Elohistic. That means that the divine name Yahweh, Lord, all caps, is used less frequently than the more generic name for God, the Elohim, the mighty one. So Elohim will predominate in this psalm. As we look at the first stanza, we see the march is beginning and God is arising. God is beginning his march. His enemies are scattered before him. They're fleeing, they're being driven away, and they're perishing before him. A couple metaphors that illustrate this. Smoke driven away smoke just through the power of the wind can drive smoke away to make it to dissipate, and as wax melts melts before fire. So again, quickly weakening, softening at God's presence. So that's a dramatic image of God's enemies just disappearing quickly and melting away before him. The response of the righteous to this is to rejoice and be glad, to exult, to be jubilant. And so then this leads us to our second stanza, which is a call to praise. Sing to God, sing praises, lift up a song to him, exult before him. And we can see in each stanza there are linking words that connect one stanza to the next. So here we have jubilation, exultation before him. He is identified as the one who rides through the deserts, or some translations say clouds. Either case is true. He rides through the clouds and the deserts. And his name is Yahweh. His actions toward the marginalized among the people are stated in verse 5. He is the father of the fatherless. It's fascinating because God is rarely referred to as a father in the Old Testament, but here and elsewhere he is the father of the orphan. He is the protector. He is the husband of the widow. This is God in his holy habitation, his holy house, the place where he dwells. That would be the tabernacle that they carried, the tent of meeting that they brought from Sinai to Zion. God settles the solitary in a home. He leads out the prisoners to prosperity, thinking here probably of the enslaved Hebrew people in Israel, brought from that slavery into the promised land flowing of milk and honey, but the rebellious dwell in a parched land. So God seems to show special concern for the fatherless, the widow, the lonely, the enslaved, special concern for them. But the rebellious dwell in a parched land, and this, again, our linking word is the wilderness in verse 7. God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, The earthquake, the heavens poured down rain before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel. Rain in abundance, O God, you shed abroad. You restored your inheritance as it languished. So it describes God leading his people from Egypt, out of slavery, through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, from Sinai into the promised land. Verse 9 references the abundance of rain, which is not referenced in the accounts of the Exodus in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but this gives us some insight that while they were in the wilderness, God provided rain for his people. Your flock, verse 10, found a dwelling in it. Again, I'm highlighting the names of God there. They found a dwelling. Your flock is a typical reference for Israel as a flock of sheep. God is their shepherd. God provided for the needy. Verse 11 describes the following, what followed after the conquest, that the word came back to the camp, that there's been a great victory. So the women were announcing that news. There were a great number of them, a great host. As they declare, the kings of the armies, they're fleeing. The Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land are frightened. We think Jericho. As the Israelites went up to Jericho, the word was that this army of Israel could not be defeated, and so they had their way of the land, and so the women are sharing this good news. They're celebrating. They're dividing the spoil of victory. As the Canaanites flee their cities, the Israelites collected the goods that they left behind. Men lay fallen, dead in the sheepfolds, but Israel was covered with silver. Israel here is portrayed as a dove. That's a common image. Israel as a bird. In fact, God will portray himself as a bird, hiding in the shadow of his wings. So Israel here is the dove covered in silver, pinions with gold, meaning that Israel enjoyed the spoils of war. They received goods that they had not made. They inherited lands that were not initially theirs, vineyards that were already planted. This is all seen as the blessing from God. When the Almighty scatters kings there, let snow fall on Zalman. So here's one of those verses that is unclear in its meaning. It's possible that Zalman is a mountain near Shechem, or maybe further to the north in the east, Yabal Druz, east of Bashan. I'm going to go with that because of the reference to Bashan in verse 15. So snow falling on Zalman. These were volcanic mountains. They're black basalt. So snow falling on a mountain, a black mountain, covering it would be quite a dramatic thing. And so seems that that's the metaphor, that the kings are scattered afar. So this is to the north and to the east, or maybe it's they're falling like snow. Not really sure exactly what the metaphor means, but those are some possibilities. In verse 15, we see some jealousy, and that the mountains of Bashan look with hatred at the mount that God desired for his people. So mountains were the dwelling places of the gods. The ancients built temples there. And so the mountains of Bashan would be the dwelling places of the gods of Canaan, but they are looking with hatred at the mountain that God chose, and this would be Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Jealousy, hatred. We see this also elsewhere in Psalm 48 speaks of this as well. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. So God's army is fighting on Israel's behalf. Chariots were the elite weapons of the ancient world. Israel didn't have chariots. For the most part, they flirted with them for a bit, but these were rapid strike weapons. That Israel was just not a horse culture. They didn't have the weaponry for this, so they acknowledge that it's not their army, but it's the army of God fighting on their behalf. Yahweh, or the Lord, is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. There's the key phrase, verse 17. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. The God of Sinai has moved with his people through the wilderness, through the conquest of Canaan, is now setting up shop, setting up his home in Sinai, in Zion, in the sanctuary. Verse 18, you ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train, receiving gifts among men, even among the rebellious, that the Lord God may dwell there. So this is speaking of the way in the ancient world that the conquering king or general would come into the city with the spoils of war, the victory, the captives in his train following him, enslaved, and then receiving gifts from the defeated, tribute. And so that is the image here of God ascending his throne in Zion and just completely and utterly victorious. The God of Sinai is now in the sanctuary. Second half of the psalm, again, highlighting the names of God here, the Lord 3 times, Yahweh 2 times, but Elohim 15 times. So name of God, Elohim, dominating the second half of the psalm as well. Verse 19 is a beautiful verse that the Lord daily bears up. He is the one that bears us up. He is a God of salvation. He delivers us from death. So the benevolence of God, his victory expressed in the defeat of his enemies. He strikes their heads. That's a mortal wound, a fatal wound. And the Lord will bring them back from Bashan, that is to the north, to the mountains, and bring them up from the depths of the sea, that's down low and to the west, that you may strike your feet in their blood. The tongues of your dogs may have their portion from the foe. So David is describing here God's enemies have been so utterly defeated that it's a bloodbath. You can strike your feet in their blood. Similar language in Psalm 58 of total and complete victory and humiliation of the enemies of God. In verses 24 through 27, we get a glimpse of Israelite worship. It's in the form of a procession. The procession of God is seen coming up the road and then into the sanctuary. There are singers in front and the musicians at the last, those stringed instruments, percussion, wind instruments, and between them, the virgins playing tambourines, so percussion, probably some dancing implied in there. And they're saying, bless God in the great congregation, O Yahweh, you who are Israel's fountain. Psalm 87:7 says, all my fountains are in you. That's the song that they sang in Psalm 87. So a suggestion here that God is their fountain. God is their source of life. Fresh water then and now is key to life. And so God was their fresh water, their fountain. In the procession, we see a particular ordering of the tribes that's interesting. Benjamin, that would be the house of Saul, the first king of Israel. Then the princes of Judah, that would be David from the line of Judah. And then Zebulun, Naphtali, these were some of the northern kingdom tribes. Later, the nation would be divided into 2. The northern tribes are perhaps referenced there, even though this is before that division took place. Victory will continue, is the prayer. Summon your power that you've worked for us. Kings shall bear gifts to you. Rebuke the beasts that dwell among the reeds. This is probably a reference to Egypt. They were a beast of a nation. They lived among the reeds of the Nile River. They were a herd of bulls with the calves of the people. Trample them underfoot. Scatter the peoples who are warmongers. Nobles shall come from Egypt. Cush shall stretch out her hands to God. Cush, that is upper Egypt or southern Egypt. So it's describing the kings coming to bring tribute to God and worshiping him. And it's quite a turn of events for the nation of Israel, who spent 400 years in Egypt, much of that as slaves. And now this is depicting a reversal of all those things as Egypt comes bringing gifts to God and to Israel. The psalm concludes with a doxology, inviting all the kingdoms to worship the God who rides in the heavens, the ancient heavens, who sends out his voice, his mighty voice, whose power is in the sky. He's in his sanctuary. He's awesome. We see some similar language in Psalm 29, so you might want to check that out. But the psalm concludes with this vibrant call to worship that corresponds to the call to worship back in verse 4. It is a picture of Israel's history, the seminal event in Israel's history, the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, the conquest, the things that made them into a nation, and now they are settled in the land, and the sanctuary of God is set up in Zion.